you find yourself drifting slowly into a desert that seems endless. The dunes stretch outward like an ocean of golden waves, rising and falling in slow rhythms, carrying the weight of centuries of wind. This is the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter of Arabia, one of the most desolate and inhospitable places on earth. And yet, buried beneath its sands, legend insists that a city once thrived here. Traders, poets, and explorers called it Ubar, a place whispered about as the Atlantis of the sands. Unlike Atlantis, which emerged from Greek imagination, Ubar lingers between myth and history. Arab oral traditions carried stories of a city punished by God, a settlement of wealth and arrogance, suddenly swallowed by the desert. The Quran itself mentions a people called Iram of the Pillars, who built grand towers in the desert and defied warnings until destruction overtook them. For generations, the location of this lost city remained uncertain. Was it real, or was it simply a cautionary tale woven into the dunes? For the desert travelers centuries ago, Ubar was more than a legend. Caravans moving through the Arabian Peninsula relied on oases scattered among the sands. A city like Ubar would have been a lifeline to stop for water, supplies, and trade along the frankincense routes that stretched from Oman to the Mediterranean. Frankincense, the hardened resin of boswellia trees, was once among the most valued commodities in the world, used in temples, funerals, and rituals across Egypt, Greece, and Rome. It created a wealth that transformed barren deserts into corridors of prosperity. Imagine the monotony of desert trade. A merchant, would load camels with sacks of dried resin, each animal carrying up to 300 pounds. The caravan trudged slowly across scorching plains, moving 15 to 20 miles a day. The sun pressed heavily upon your shoulders, and the sand's glare forced you to wrap your face in cloth. Water skins had to be rationed carefully. One mistake, and thirst would punish the entire caravan. A city like Ubar, if it truly stood here, would have been salvation. The moment the towers appeared on the horizon, even through mirages, a weary merchant's heart would have lightened. What fascinates historians is that Ubar persisted in maps and travelers' accounts. Even into the European Middle Ages, medieval geographers drew strange towers deep within Arabia, marking them as the city of Iram. In the 16th century, explorers reported hearing Bedouins speak of a ruined city swallowed by the sand. Centuries of stories suggested that somewhere beneath dunes and shifting landscapes, traces of walls and roads still waited. And then, in the late 20th century, technology began to catch up with myth. In the 1980s, archaeologists, guided by satellite imagery from NASA, spotted what looked like old caravan trails converging on a single point in the Omani desert. The satellite photographs revealed faint scars on the earth, as if countless feet and hooves had worn down paths over centuries. These tracks all pointed to one site, Shisr. Excavations there uncovered collapsed stone towers, pottery fragments, and evidence of a massive underground water system. The oasis of Shisr, some scholars argue, was Ubar itself. The city, it seems, may have been built upon a limestone cavern. Over time, as wells were dug deeper and the ground hollowed, the cavern collapsed. Without its water supply, the settlement could not survive. What was left crumbled and was slowly buried beneath the sands. A legend of divine punishment, perhaps, had been born from something as ordinary and tragic as geology. Still, the story is not so simple. Some historians caution against calling Shisr the Atlantis of the sands. What archaeologists uncover may have been only a fortress or outpost along the caravan routes, not a thriving city. The romance of Ubar as a shining metropolis of wealth may have grown over centuries of retelling, exaggerated by poets, storytellers, and explorers who wanted the desert to hold mysteries as grand as the seas. But whether Ubar was a city of towers or a mere way station, its role in the frankincense trade cannot be dismissed. Think of the scale. Every year, tons of resin moved northward, feeding empires with its fragrance. Temples in Jerusalem burned it on altars. Roman households used it for perfumes. Egyptian embalmers sealed it into wrappings of their dead. Caravans passing through Arabia were arteries of global trade long before ships replaced them. Ubar or Shisha was part of that system, a node in the fragile web of desert survival. And what did daily life in such a place look like? Not as glamorous as legends might suggest. Inhabitants lived in mud brick homes or stone dwellings built close to wells. Water had to be hauled daily from underground reservoirs, a task that defined survival. Frankincense was harvested in southern Oman and then transported north. So families here likely worked as traders, camel herders, and guardians of caravan routes. Life was slow, repetitive, and dictated by the rhythm of supply and demand. Sandstorms swept through at times, coating every surface in dust, forcing people indoors. Nights were quieter, the desert sky, unpolluted, glittered with stars. A reminder of how small their settlement truly was against the vast emptiness. You can picture a watchman, stationed on one of Ubar's towers. His duty was monotonous but crucial, scanning the horizon for approaching caravans or raiders. Hour after hour, he looked out at the dunes, where the line between mirage and reality blurred. Perhaps he thought of his children asleep at home or the weariness of hauling water yet again. Such details rarely survive in chronicles, yet they capture the essence of what this lost city must have been, not merely a place of wealth, but a place of ordinary human endurance in the harshest of environments. The silence of the desert, broken only by wind, still clings to Shisha today. The ruined walls do not tell stories of arrogance punished by God, but of people who once found ways to endure, only to be undone by shifting earth beneath their feet. And yet, legends have power. The very idea that a city could vanish beneath sand stirs imagination, reminding us of how fragile human effort can be when pitted against nature's vastness. So was Ubar truly the Atlantis of the sands, a city of pillars, towers, and immense wealth swallowed by divine will? Or was it a modest outpost, exaggerated into myth by centuries of storytelling, and the hunger of explorers to find wonders in the desert? When you pause to think about Ubar, it becomes clear that much of its mystery comes not from what is known, but from what is missing. Archaeologists can piece together fragments of broken pottery, stones collapsed from towers, and faint outlines of ancient tracks, but the daily rhythms, the conversations, and the small habits of those who lived there, those are hidden. And perhaps that is why the story of Ubar feels both captivating and dull. It is not a tale of sudden conquest or dramatic fire, but of a place quietly swallowed by shifting sands. To understand why Ubar was important at all, you must imagine the desert economy. The frankincense trade shaped life across southern Arabia for thousands of years. Frankincense trees grew in narrow bands of land in what is today Oman, Yemen, and Somalia. Harvesting the resin was a slow, repetitive process. Farmers cut small slits in the bark, allowing the tree to weep drops of sap. These hardened into yellowish tears that could be collected. After several weeks, families would harvest in the same way year after year, filling baskets with the brittle gum. There was no glamour in the work, only patience. Once gathered, the resin was packed into sacks, loaded onto camels, and prepared for journeys north. Caravans might consist of dozens, even hundreds, of animals each day. The same routines were repeated, waking before dawn, checking hooves, tightening straps, and walking alongside the animals under the relentless sun. Ubar's role was to serve these caravans. It was a watering hole, a resting station, and perhaps a small marketplace where supplies changed hands. Without places like Ubar, long-distance desert trade would have been nearly impossible. The physical remains discovered at Shisha, the site linked to Ubar, tell us more about function than grandeur. Excavations revealed a fortress-like structure with 8 tall towers, most of which collapsed into a sinkhole. This fortress likely served both as storage and as a point of defense. Raiders and bandits were not uncommon, and guarding water supplies was essential. Imagine standing guard at night, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks of stone, always watching for the silhouette of strangers on camelback. Daily life in such a place was routine, even boring, by design. People fetched water, baked bread, mended ropes, and traded goods. Children likely carried buckets, tended goats, or collected fuel for fires. Their laughter or crying would have mingled with the constant sound of the wind. Meals were simple, flatbread cooked on hot stones, dates, dried meat, and occasionally milk from camels. A traveler arriving with figs, nuts, or spices from distant regions would have brought a welcome change. Still, the wealth generated by frankincense bar, however small, stood within a global network. Resin from these desserts was burned in Roman temples, perfumed Egyptian households, and became part of rituals in India and China. Imagine the strange thought that the labor of a farmer in southern Oman ended up sending ceremonies in distant lands he would never see. This invisible thread tied a bar to civilizations thousands of miles away. Though its own inhabitants remain confined to the desert, the legend of Ubar as Atlantis of the Sands likely grew because outsiders longed to find a desert counterpart to the great cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt. When explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries entered Arabia, they were driven as much by imagination as by scholarship. T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, referred to it as a kind of desert Atlantis. His words added glamour to what might otherwise have been a modest outpost. Writers and journalists repeated the comparison until it hardened into myth. The reality of fortress over a water source seemed far too ordinary. But ordinary stories rarely capture attention. Technology, however, revealed what myths could not. In the 1980s, NASA's satellite images showed caravan tracks converging on Shisar. From space, the desert looked like a vast pale sheet, but the faint lines of old pathways appeared as scars still visible centuries later. Archaeologists followed these scars and reached the site, uncovering ruins that confirmed at least part of the tradition. But disappointment followed quickly. Where people hoped to find a glittering city of towers and bustling streets, they found only a collapsed fort. Yet this anticlimax is what makes Ubar's story suited to the kind of history told here: boring, understated, yet deeply human. Civilization often declines not with catastrophe, but with gradual erosion. In Ubar's case, the ground beneath its fortress gave way. A limestone cavern collapsed, draining the water system and undermining the walls. Once water disappeared, people had no reason to remain. They moved on, leaving stones behind. Over centuries, the desert erased traces of their presence, covering the site with sand. This image of a city undone not by war, but by thirst carries quiet power. Imagine carrying water buckets day after day, lowering them into a well that seemed eternal. Then, one morning, the rope strikes only air. The well has collapsed, the water gone. Panic spreads slowly. Families argue, merchants pack their camels, and guards stand idle because there is nothing left to protect. People drift away until the silence deepens. The desert does not roar its victory. It merely waits until the last voice fades. And so, Ubar passed into memory. Travelers spoke of ruins buried by sand, and poets embellished those stories with warnings of divine punishment. By the time European explorers heard these tales, Ubar had already become a legend. But behind every legend lies a quieter reality. People living ordinary lives, depending on fragile water systems, undone by forces beyond their control. When you think of Ubar, you might be tempted to compare it to other lost cities: Pompeii buried in ash, Petra carved into red cliffs, and Machu Picchu hidden in mountains. But Ubar's silence is different. It does not overwhelm with spectacle. Instead, it lingers with the idea that survival can collapse without notice. A water source disappears, and an entire settlement with centuries of effort fades into dust. As you let this thought rest in your mind, you may wonder, do we prefer the myth of Ubar because the reality feels too ordinary? Is it easier to believe in a shining desert city punished for its arrogance than to face the quiet truth that civilizations can vanish simply because their wells run dry? By the time the last families abandoned Ubar, the desert had already begun its quiet work of erasure. Wine-driven grains of sand gathered in corners, coating walls, filling doorways, and smoothing rough edges of stone. Camels trudge away along the ancient caravan routes, their shadows long in the setting sun, while the fortress stood hollow, listening to silence. A place that once promised safety and refreshment became nothing more than another dune. The collapse of Ubar is often framed as dramatic a punishment, a divine strike, a swallowed city. But when you examine it closely, what happened was painfully mundane. Limestone caverns under the settlement weakened as generations drew water from wells. The ground gave way, towers toppled, and the wells went dry. People could not live where water no longer flowed. There was no fire, no invasion, no conquest, only thirst. And yet, in human memory, thirst is rarely enough of a story. That is why a legend stepped in. The Quranic tale of Iram, of the pillars, described a people who built towering structures, ignored warnings, and were destroyed. Oral traditions among Bedouins told of a city buried in sand as punishment for arrogance. Travelers from Europe, eager to imagine Arabia as mysterious and exotic, repeated these stories. Ubar transformed from an ordinary settlement into the Atlantis of the desert. It is worth pausing on this point. Civilizations are often remembered less for what they were than for what others needed them to be. For Arab poets, Ubar became a moral tale about hubris. For explorers, it became a symbol of discovery. For archaeologists, it was a puzzle solved with satellites and excavation tools. For us, listening now, it becomes a reminder that even the most ordinary communities can leave behind echoes louder than their walls. Think for a moment about what life was like at the very end. A mother drawing her last bucket of water from a failing well. A merchant realized that his camels, thirsty and restless, could not wait much longer. Children watching adults argue about whether to leave. Someone marking the doorframe of their house one last time before stepping away. None of these moments were grand. They were quiet, hesitant, and filled with resignation. Yet they defined the end more than any legend of towers collapsing in divine wrath. When the ruins fell fully silent, the desert carried them into obscurity. Generations passed. Caravans altered their routes. Other oases grew, and others failed. Ubar disappeared into memory, into whispers told around campfires. Until centuries later, men in khaki uniforms with notebooks and cameras arrived to search again. The rediscovery of Ubar in the late 20th century did not change the world. It did not yield golden treasures or vast libraries. What it offered was something smaller, a confirmation that human beings once lived here, clung to survival, and then slipped away. Archaeologists found pottery, tools, and collapsed towers, not riches, but evidence of endurance, and that, in its way, is more revealing than gold. You, listening now, can imagine standing at Shisar today. The ruins lie under a hot sky, surrounded by sand, with faint outlines of walls and a sinkhole yawning where the ground once gave way. The wind moves slowly through broken stones. There is no crowd, no sound, but your own breath. It feels less like a grand discovery and more like walking into the memory of ordinary people who once tried, for a time, to carve out life here. Why then does Ubar continue to fascinate? Perhaps because its lesson is uncomfortable. Empires often fall not in battle, but in silence. Cities can be undone by drought, erosion, neglect, or the shifting of trade routes. When the desert swallows a city, it does so without spectacle, without mercy, and without pause. The sands do not care if the city was arrogant or humble, wealthy or poor. They simply move. This is why Ubar matters, not because it was great, but because it was fragile. Because it shows that human survival often depends on resources more delicate than we admit: a water table, a harvest, a trade route. When those disappear, even the strongest walls crumble. Ubar's story lingers not as proof of grandeur, but as a reminder of how quickly endurance can fail. And so the question remains, what do we believe about Ubar? Do we cling to the legend of a shining desert city, punished and buried for its pride? Or do we accept the quieter truth that it was likely a modest outpost, undone by geology and thirst, remembered only because storytellers could not resist turning silence into myth? Perhaps both answers coexist. Ubar is at once a real place of stone and wells and a myth carried by imagination. To walk among its ruins is to feel the weight of both truths pressing together, the boredom of daily life and the grandeur of human storytelling. As you let this thought settle, ask yourself, how many other cities, perhaps even our own, might one day become nothing but whispers beneath sand? When you think of ancient Egypt, certain names rise up immediately: Memphis, Thebes, Luxor, Karnak, and, of course, Giza with its pyramids standing against the desert sky. These places dominate our imagination, filling textbooks, museum halls, and documentaries. But there was once another capitalist city that ruled Egypt during the late New Kingdom, an early Third Intermediate period, a place that commanded temples, treasuries, and armies. Today, its name barely lingers outside scholarly circles. That city is Tanis. Hidden for centuries beneath the Nile Delta's shifting mud, Tanis was not meant to be forgotten. In its time, it stood as the political heart of Lower Egypt, a city of kings, priests, and traders. Built on the northeastern edge of the delta, Tanis flourished when the Nile's branches shifted, creating fertile lands for agriculture and routes for trade. Yet unlike Thebes or Giza, Tanis was not embraced by desert sands that preserved monuments for millennia. Instead, the damp, unstable soil of the delta swallowed stone foundations, eroded walls, and sank buildings into marshland. What the desert preserves, the delta destroys. The origins of Tanis go back to around the 21st dynasty, when the fragmentation of Egyptian power forced new centers to emerge. After the collapse of the New Kingdom, Egypt's pharaohs could no longer control the vast territories of earlier centuries. Foreign invasions, internal divisions, and economic weakness reduced the empire's reach. In this moment of weakness, Tanis rose. Pharaohs like Susan's I established the city as their royal seat, building temples, palaces, and tombs to rival those of Thebes. Walking through Tanis in its prime would not have inspired the awe of Giza's pyramids, but it carried its own grandeur. Enormous temples dedicated to Amun-Ra and Khonsu dominated the city center. Massive stone blocks, many recycled from older monuments, created a skyline of pylons, obelisks, and courtyards. The pharaohs of Tanis claimed legitimacy by imitating the great building traditions of earlier dynasties. Stone was hauled from quarries, carved into statues, and erected in sacred precincts. Yet this imitation was also practical. Much of Tanis was built from reused blocks taken from older, abandoned cities like Pyramuses. That recycling is part of why Tanis confuses historians. Walking among its ruins today, you would see colossal statues of Ramses II, sphinxes carved centuries earlier, and reliefs from earlier dynasties. It looks as though Tanis was the city of Ramses himself, when in truth, its pharaohs simply moved his monuments to their new home for archaeologists. This makes Tanis a puzzle, a city of borrowed grandeur, stitched together from fragments of Egypt's past. And yet, in these fragments, the daily life of Tanis thrived. Imagine the narrow streets behind the temples. Mud brick houses line them, where families cooked lentils and barley, baked bread in clay ovens, and traded goods in open courtyards. Children splashed in shallow pools during the flooding season, while fishermen cast nets into canals. Scribes carried rolls of papyrus, recording taxes and inventories. Priests performed rituals with methodical precision, offering incense to gods in dim sanctuaries while sunlight flickered through high doorways. The location of Tanis gave it importance beyond ritual. At the edge of the eastern delta, it connected Egypt to trade routes heading toward Canaan, Phoenicia, and the wider Mediterranean. Ships loaded with cedar wood, wine, oil, and luxury goods moved through its harbors. Traders speaking foreign tongues passed through its markets, carrying news from distant lands. Tanis was both Egyptian and international, a place where the Nile met the world. Still, Tanis never shook its fragility. Unlike Thebes or Memphis, whose names echoed for centuries. Tanis was bound to the geography of the delta. The Nile's waters shifted constantly, silting up channels and abandoning harbors. What was once a thriving trade port could, within decades, become a stagnant marsh. The prosperity of Tanis depended not only on kings, but also on the unpredictable course of a river. Modern archaeology stumbled upon Tanis almost by accident in the 19th century. Explorers searching for Pyramus, the famous city of Ramses II, uncovered massive ruins in the delta. The colossal statues and obelisks convinced them they had found Pyramus itself. For years, scholars misidentified Tanis, confusing its recycled monuments for original ones. Only later, with deeper excavations and careful study, did it become clear that Tanis was a distinct city, one that had borrowed the legacy of others. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in 1939, when French archaeologist Pierre Montet unearthed royal tombs in Tanis. Inside, he found treasures that rivaled those of Tutankhamun: golden masks, silver coffins, jewelry, and weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. The tombs of Susan's Eye and other pharaohs revealed a city of wealth and power, despite its later obscurity. And yet, because this discovery coincided with the outbreak of World War II, it never captured global attention in the way Tutankhamun's tomb did. Once again, Tanis slipped into the margins of history. If you were to walk among the ruins today, you might be struck less by grandeur than by silence. Columns lie broken on the ground, sphinxes eroded by time, and walls half sunk into muddy soil. Unlike the desert monuments of Luxor, these stones sit under skies heavy with humidity. Surrounded by farmland and marshes, farmers still plant crops nearby, just as their ancestors did. But the great capital of pharaohs is a scatter of ruins hidden in fields. What is most striking is how ordinary life once persisted in this extraordinary setting. The priests and kings left inscriptions, but the farmers left furrows in soil. The bakers left ovens, and the fishermen left hooks for every golden mask. There were thousands of clay pots, filled with lentils or barley, for every colossal statue of Ramses. There were countless children carrying water jars from canals. These quiet details, long eroded, are the true texture of Tanis. And yet the question lingers: how does a city once so powerful become so forgotten? Was Tanis simply unlucky, trapped in a geography that consumed stone faster than the desert preserved it? Or is there something about human memory that prefers pyramids and sand over temples and marsh? The story of Tanis takes a sharper shape when you focus on its royal tombs. For centuries, the tombs of Egypt's great kings were assumed to be exhausted. The Valley of the Kings, once full of treasures, had been picked over by grave robbers long before modern archaeologists arrived. Tutankhamun's discovery in 1922 was a shock precisely because it was so rare, an intact burial untouched for millennia. But nearly 2 decades later, in a place few outside Egypt had ever heard of, something similar unfolded. In 1939, French archaeologist Pierre Montet was excavating at Tanis. He had been working in the delta for years, carefully tracing walls, studying sphinxes, and cataloging fragments. The work was slow and damp. The delta soil clung to boots, and the ruins were often waterlogged. It was not the romantic image of desert archaeology, where golden sunlight bleaches sand and pyramids rise in the distance. Here, excavation meant mud, mosquitoes, and constant seepage. Then Montet's team stumbled upon a tomb entrance. Inside, they discovered a burial untouched since antiquity. The tomb belonged to Susan's Eye, a pharaoh of the 21st dynasty. Unlike Tutankhamun's golden coffin, Susan's was encased in a massive silver sarcophagus. Silver was rarer in Egypt than gold, imported through difficult trade, making this coffin more extraordinary than the golden ones we're used to imagining. Alongside the sarcophagus lay treasures: massive gold, jewelry, weapons inlaid with precious stones, and amulets designed to guide the pharaoh into the afterlife. It was a discovery that should have shaken the world. But it was 1939. War had broken out in Europe, and global attention shifted to battlefields, invasions, and politics. Newspaper space that might have carried headlines about Tanis instead carried news of armies crossing borders. Montet's discovery, though incredible, was buried by history even as it emerged from the ground. Still, for historians, the tombs of Tanis are vital. They show that even in an era often dismissed as Egypt's decline, its rulers commanded wealth, artistry, and ritual sophistication. The masks and jewelry rival anything from the height of earlier dynasties. The coffins, layered one within another, carried inscriptions invoking gods and protective spells. Though the delta soil eroded temples and houses, these tombs preserved a glimpse of Tanis at its height. Daily life around these burials must have continued in rhythms as predictable as the Nile. Priests recited funerary texts, artisans carved amulets, and workers prepared coffins layer by layer. Somewhere beyond the temple precinct, farmers tended wheat and barley, fishermen cast nets, and children played by canals. For every royal burial, there were hundreds of ordinary death's burials in simple pits or small coffins, without gold or silver, only the quiet ritual of farewell. Archaeology at Tanis also reveals how the city was a patchwork of Egypt's past. The pharaohs of Tanis, lacking resources to quarry new stone, recycled monuments from Pyramid's and other sites. Obelisks inscribed with the names of Ramses II stand in Tanis, though Ramses never ruled there. Sphinxes carved centuries earlier were dragged across the delta mud to adorn Tanis's temples. Even sarcophagi may have been reused, chiseled with new inscriptions over faint traces of older names. This recycling gives Tanis a strange feeling. To walk its ruins is to walk through layers of history compressed into one place. A statue of a god might bear marks of 2 dynasties. A block of stone could once have stood in a temple 100 miles away. Tanis was not just a capital, it was an archive, a collection of Egypt's older greatness, reassembled to project authority in a time of weakness. But this patchwork legacy also made Tanis fragile. As the Nile shifted, canals silted, and harbors dried, the city's economic lifelines weakened. Trade that once flowed through its markets slowed, and new centers rose elsewhere. Memphis and Thebes outlasted Tanis not because they were stronger, but because geography favored them. The Nile Delta is restless, branches shift, floodplains migrate, and settlements sink. What is built there is often swallowed sooner than in the desert. Imagine living in Tanis during these slow changes. At first, the harbor grew shallower. Traders grumbled that ships could not dock as easily. Farmers noticed that floods no longer spread evenly, leaving some fields dry and others drowned. Priests repeated rituals in crumbling temples, sweeping away mud that seeped into floors after the rainy season. Children who once played near bustling markets now wandered through quiet courtyards where fewer merchants gathered. The decline was not sudden, not obvious day to day, but gradual, as if the city itself exhaled its strength little by little. Even so, the people of Tanis endured. They repaired walls, shifted canals, and built dikes. Families continued to bake bread, haul water, and send offerings to the gods. Life in a fading city was not about collapse, but persistence. Archaeologists uncovered this. Persistence in the most ordinary objects: broken pottery, bread molds, fishing hooks, and amulets cheap enough for common burials. These remnants tell us that Tanis was not only a city of kings, but also of ordinary people who worked, prayed, and hoped. By the time later dynasties rose, Tanis was already fading. Alexandria, built by the Greeks after Alexander the Great, became Egypt's new window to the Mediterranean. Memphis maintained religious authority, and Thebes held ritual significance. Tanis slipped further into obscurity, its monuments sinking deeper into marsh and mud. By the Roman era, its name barely appeared in records. The silence of Tanis today is deceptive. To stand among its ruins, you hear only the buzz of insects, the occasional call of birds, and the faint rustle of crops in the delta breeze. Farmers till land beside fallen obelisks. Cattle graze near colossal statues of Ramses II that were dragged here long after his death. What once was the seat of pharaohs is now simply part of the Nile countryside. And yet, when archaeologists opened Susan's tomb and lifted his golden mask, they uncovered a reminder that power had once flowed here. The craftsmanship rivaled the splendor of Thebes. The wealth rivaled Memphis. The ritual devotion rivaled any other Egyptian capital. Tanis was not a shadow. It was, in its time, a center. Only memory failed it, allowing sand, mud, and silence to erase its claim. It is tempting to ask, if Tanis's treasures had been discovered in 1922, before war broke out, would the world know its name as well as Tutankhamun's? Would schoolchildren learn Tanis alongside Giza and Luxor? Or is the forgetting of Tanis part of its destiny? A city built on shifting ground, destined to fade back into the earth. By the time Tanis slipped into its last centuries, the city no longer commanded the Nile Delta with the same authority. What had once been the seat of pharaohs became instead a provincial town. Its temples weathered, its canals silted, and its palaces fading into marshland. Egyptian power shifted elsewhere, and Tanis remained behind like a shadow of past grandeur. Unlike Thebes, which still carried ritual importance, or Memphis, which remained a symbol of continuity, Tanis was abandoned by memory as surely as it was abandoned by the river's flow. The decline of Tanis was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, like the drying of a canal. A few generations after its peak, harbors clogged with silt, forcing merchants to reroute their trade. Priests continued rituals in crumbling sanctuaries, their voices echoing in halls where fewer worshippers gathered. Families repaired houses again and again as dampness rotted mud brick walls. Floodwaters sometimes returned with too much force, swallowing streets in stagnant pools. Other years, the waters receded too quickly, leaving soil cracked and infertile. To live in Tanis at this time was to live with constant adjustment, patching holes in a city that was quietly sinking. The tombs, though hidden, stood as silent witnesses. Susan's eye and his successors lay in their silver and gold, sealed in coffins that would survive. Even as the city above crumbled, their wealth outlasted their walls. The ordinary people who had buried their loved ones in simpler graves could not have imagined that one day archaeologists would unearth royal splendor, while their own lives vanished without trace. A silver coffin might endure, a clay-bred mold might not. Memory, like geography, is uneven. Modern archaeology's encounter with Tanis highlights this unevenness. When Pierre Montet uncovered the royal tombs in 1939, he proved that Tanis was once a capital equal in wealth to Thebes or Memphis. Yet the world hardly noticed. War drowned out headlines, and the discovery was overshadowed by the earlier glamour of Tutankhamun. Even within archaeology, Tanis felt like a quieter note, important to specialists, overlooked by the public. It is telling that many visitors to Egypt today never hear of Tanis, though its treasures sit in museums under bright glass. The city lived in obscurity during its decline, and it continues in obscurity now. And yet, to walk its ruins today is to sense the quiet persistence of human life. Farmers guide donkeys through fields that brush against fallen obelisks. Children play near colossal statues of Ramses II that were dragged here centuries after his reign. Insects hum, birds call across canals, and the delta's sun rises just as it did thousands of years ago. The grand city is gone, but life continues in small, repetitive gestures. In this way, Tanis never truly disappeared. It simply shifted from capital to countryside. One of the most striking features of Tanis is its recycling. Unlike Thebes or Giza, where monuments were carved specifically for their settings, Tanis became a repository of Egypt's past. Colossal statues, sphinxes, and obelisks taken from Pyramuses were repositioned here. The pharaohs of Tanis inscribed their names over those of earlier kings, layering authority across centuries. Archaeologists today see these faint palimpsests, older names partially erased, newer names chiseled over them. The city itself became a metaphor for memory, a place constantly overwritten, where one era covered another. But memory written in stone can still fade. The delta's soil, heavy with moisture, eroded hieroglyphs and cracked walls, Sand may preserve, but mud consumes. Unlike the desert cities, where dry winds mummify stone and papyrus, the delta swallows and decays. For this reason, Tanis left fewer intact records than Thebes or Memphis. Its grandeur was lost not because it was lesser, but because it was unlucky in geography. And that raises the question, how many other Tanises exist? Forgotten not because they lack greatness, but because nature eroded their traces. Archaeologists know that preservation often dictates history. Civilizations remembered are those that built in stone and dry lands. Civilizations forgotten are those whose homes crumbled in damp soil. Tanis stands as a reminder that what we know of the past is shaped less by what happened than by what survived. The story of Tanis does not end with its ruins. Its treasures, masks, jewelry, coffins rest in Cairo's museums, quietly stunning those who pause to look. Visitors who wander past Tutankhamun's mask may notice Susan's eyes' golden face, gleaming with equal artistry. Few linger, but those who do see proof that Egypt's so-called decline still held extraordinary skill. In this way, Tanis lives again not as a city, but as a collection of objects, fragments of a life erased by geography, but preserved by chance. So what does Tanis teach us? Perhaps that memory is selective, shaped by accident as much as achievement. Perhaps that even capitals can vanish if rivers shift and soil erodes. Perhaps that greatness does not guarantee remembrance. Tanis was once the beating heart of Egypt's delta, its kings buried in splendor, its temples filled with incense, its harbors alive with ships. Now it is quiet farmland, dotted with ruins that most tourists never see. If you close your eyes, you might hear the faint echoes of what once was, the clang of chisels shaping obelisks, the chanting of priests before dawn, the creak of ships docking at canals. Then, slowly, the sounds fade, replaced by the buzz of mosquitoes, the shuffle of farmers in fields, and the sigh of the delta wind. The layers collapse into one another until all that remains is the question: how many more cities, great in their time, will slip beneath the sands and mud of history, remembered only by accident? When you hear the word civilization, your thoughts may go first to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, or perhaps to Greece and Rome. But long before marble temples rose in Athens or pyramids stood in Giza, there was another civilization, quieter, less monumental in appearance, and for centuries almost entirely forgotten. This was the Indus Valley civilization, one of the world's earliest urban societies, and at its heart stood Mohenjo-Daro, a city now buried beneath dust and silence in what is today Pakistan's Sindh province. Mohenjo-Daro means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, though the people who lived there likely called it by another name, one we do not know. Archaeologists stumbled upon it in the 1920s, uncovering streets, walls, and artifacts that revealed a sophisticated society existing more than 4,000 years ago. At its height, around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro may have housed 30,000 to 40,000 people. Yet for all its scale, it was not a city of grand pyramids or colossal statues. Instead, its greatness lay in organization, in planning, and in the routines of daily life, the kind of details that later history often forgets. Walking through Mohenjo-Daro in your imagination, you notice something remarkable. The city feels planned. Streets run straight, crossing at right angles. Houses are laid out in blocks, many with courtyards, wells, and drains. The city seems less like it grew haphazardly over centuries and more like it was drawn on a tablet. Before being built, this grid-like order, so familiar to us today in modern cities, was extraordinary for its time. While other civilizations raised monuments to kings and gods, the people of Mohenjo-Daro built order into the very bones of their streets. Consider the drains. Each house had its own connection to a wider drainage system, with covered channels running along main streets. Wastewater could flow out of homes and away from living spaces, reducing disease and odor. Archaeologists marvel at this because similar systems would not appear in much of the world until thousands of years later. But to the inhabitants of Mohenjo-Daro, it was simply part of life. Fetch water from your well, cook your food, sweep your courtyard, empty wastewater into the drain. A routine, repeated day after day, that kept the city livable. Daily life here must have been quiet compared to the spectacle of Egyptian temples or Mesopotamian ziggurats. The houses, built of baked brick, were functional rather than monumental. Many had the stories, with stairs leading up from courtyards. Some contained small bathing areas, with carefully laid brick floors. Cooking took place in simple hearths, with grain stored in jars. Families likely ate barley bread, lentils, and perhaps dates. Much like people across the region still do, children played in alleys, chasing one another while artisans worked on beads, pottery, or copper tools. The city also had public spaces. The most famous is the so-called Great Bath, a large rectangular pool lined with bricks and bitumen to make it waterproof. Steps descended on either side, and small rooms surrounded the pool, perhaps for ritual purposes. No texts survive to tell us what ceremonies took place here, but you can imagine people gathering for communal bathing, purification, or festivals. The bath, calm and symmetrical, reflects a society that valued ritual cleanliness and collective order. Markets must have filled Mohenjo-Daro streets. Archaeologists found weights and measures made of chert standardized across the civilization. This suggests the trade was not chaotic, but carefully regulated. Merchants may have sold grain, textiles, beads, and metals in stalls, calling out prices, haggling with customers. The hum of trade, the shuffle of feet, the clatter of pottery. These sounds likely echoed through the grid-like streets day after day. What makes Mohenjo-Daro feel both extraordinary and elusive is what we do not know. The people left no deciphered texts. They used a script, small markings carved on seals and pottery. But scholars have not yet unlocked its meaning. Without their words, we are left to guess at their thoughts, beliefs, and stories. We see their streets, but not their poetry. Their drains, but not their prayers. This silence makes Mohenjo-Daro feel both familiar and distant, like walking through a city where everyone is just stepped away. Even in its quiet details, Mohenjo-Daro reveals a society deeply connected to its environment. The Indus River provided water, fertile soil, and trade routes. Farmers grew wheat, barley, and peas, irrigating fields with seasonal floods. Herds of cattle, sheep, and goats grazed nearby. Boats moved along the river, carrying goods to other settlements. The rhythm of life followed the river's flow, its floods both a blessing and a threat. Too much water could destroy crops, too little could mean famine. But perhaps the most striking feature of Mohenjo-Daro is its ordinariness. Unlike Egypt, where names of kings dominate monuments, we know almost no rulers of the Indus Valley. Unlike Mesopotamia, where gods and conquests are written on clay tablets, we have no great royal inscriptions. Mohenjo-Daro seems almost anonymous, a city not of individuals but of a collective. Its greatness lies in its systems, its organization, and its ability to sustain tens of thousands of people and relative harmony. To live there was not to live in spectacle but in routine. Way before dawn, tend fields or shops, fetch water, prepare bread, sweep the floor, bathe, rest. These tasks, repeated across thousands of homes, created the life of the city. Archaeology uncovers beads, toys, pottery, and tools, small objects that remind us of ordinary people more than kings. This ordinariness is precisely what makes Mohenjo-Daro remarkable. And yet, the city did not last. By around 1900 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro was in decline. Streets became clogged with debris, houses were abandoned, and the population thinned. Climate change, shifting rivers, and weakening trade may all have played roles. But in this first section of its story, we pause before its decline, focusing instead on its quiet order. If you stand today on the mound, among brick walls under a blazing sun, you see empty streets stretching toward the horizon. They are silent, yet their pattern still speaks. It whispers of a people who valued cleanliness, routine, and organization. It whispers of lives lived not in monuments, but in courtyards, kitchens, and baths. And so the question arises, why do we remember the pyramids of Giza and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, but not the ordered streets of Mohenjo-Daro? Is it because grandeur survives better in memory than ordinariness? Or is it because we still do not know how to read the voices of the Indus, trapped in undeciphered signs? If you look closely at the fragments unearthed in Mohenjo-Daro, you begin to see not only the outline of a city, but also the rhythm of a civilization. The Indus Valley people left no grand inscriptions declaring victories or the names of kings. Instead, they left abject seals, weights, jewelry, pottery, and tools. These fragments, scattered in the soil, give us a glimpse of how the city functioned. Among the most distinctive are the square seals carved from steatite, a soft stone polished to a smooth surface. Each seal bears small figures, animals such as bulls, elephants, and unicorn-like creatures accompanied by a line of symbols. These symbols are the Indus script. Still undeciphered, archaeologists found thousands of such seals, suggesting they were used for trade, ownership, or ritual purposes. Perhaps a merchant pressed his seal into wet clay to mark goods. Perhaps officials used them to record transactions. Perhaps priests used them for offerings. We cannot say for sure. The script remains silent, resisting modern attempts to read it. The seals remind us that Mohenjo-Daro was deeply connected to trade. Excavations reveal beads made of carnelian, lapis lazuli, and shell, materials that came from far beyond the Indus plains. Carnelian was polished in workshops into bright red-orange beads, drilled with tiny holes for necklaces. Lapis came from distant Afghanistan, carried over mountains. Shells came from coastal regions, hundreds of miles away. These objects show that the people of Mohenjo-Daro were not isolated. They traded across vast distances, linking their city to Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and beyond. In fact, Mesopotamian texts mention a land called Meluia, which many scholars believe was the Indus Valley. Imagine the quiet bustle of Mohenjo-Daro's markets. Merchants weighing goods on standardized stone cubes, traders displaying beads and shells, and farmers selling grain and dates, customers haggling over prices. Coins absent, but barter and weights precise. The sound of goods clinking, voices murmuring, and feet scuffing across brick pavements. The economy thrived not on spectacle, but on everyday exchanges repeated thousands of times. The uniformity of artifacts across the Indus Valley suggests a shared system. Pottery styles, weights, and measures were standardized across cities hundreds of miles apart. This consistency implies some form of regulation, yet we find no evidence of central kingship or military conquest. Unlike Mesopotamia, where rulers carved their names on steles, the Indus civilization left no clear signs of kings or armies. Power here seems to have been exercised differently, perhaps through councils, merchants, or religious leaders. The absence of visible rulers makes Mohenjo-Daro feel strangely anonymous, and yet, its artifacts reveal sophistication. Tools of copper and bronze show skilled metallurgy. Beads drilled with remarkable precision suggest advanced techniques. Toy small carts, whistles shaped like birds, and clay figurines reveal a society where children's play mattered. These humble objects humanize the city more than any monument could. They tell us that life in Mohenjo-Daro was not only about survival, but also about craft, creativity, and leisure. Consider the city's granaries. Large brick platforms with rows of square divisions hint at storage for grain. Farmers brought wheat and barley from surrounding fields, pouring them into storage bins. Workers recorded weights, ensuring fairness. Perhaps grain was redistributed during shortages, or perhaps it was taxed by authorities. The system reflects a society that managed surplus, controlled food, and supported large urban populations. Without such organization, tens of thousands could not have lived in one place. Water, too, shaped the city's economy. Wells dotted nearly every block, Families drew water daily, filling jars for cooking, bathing, and cleaning. Public wells ensured that even those without private ones had access. The drainage system carried waste away, reducing disease. This attention to water management reflects both practicality and cultural values. Cleanliness seems to have mattered deeply, as seen in the Great Bath and in the uniform presence of bathing areas within homes. Trade connected Mohenjo-Daro not only across the Indus but far beyond. Archaeologists found Indus seals in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian records describe merchants from Meluhha bringing exotic goods. Boats likely carried cargo down the Indus to the Arabian Sea, then across to ports in present-day Oman and Mesopotamia. Overland routes carried lapis, copper, and tin through mountain passes. In this way, Mohenjo-Daro was part of a network stretching thousands of miles, long before the Silk Road. But for all this connectivity, the city remains mute. The Indus script, inscribed on seals, pottery, and tablets, has not been deciphered. Without it, we cannot read their laws, prayers, or stories. We do not know the names of their leaders, their gods, or their myths. This silence makes Mohenjo-Daro at once tantalizing and frustrating. We see the infrastructure, the artifacts, and the trade, yet the voices of its people remain closed to us. The silence also shapes how we imagine their society. Some scholars suggest that the absence of kingship evidence points to a more egalitarian structure. Others argue that authority must have existed, simply expressed in ways we do not yet understand. The script, if deciphered, might resolve these debates, but until then, Mohenjo-Daro resists easy categorization. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, it does not fit neatly into narratives of conquest, kings, and gods. It is a civilization defined by absence as much as presence. Life for ordinary people likely revolved around work and family. Farmers plowed fields with wooden tools, herders tended cattle, and artisans sat in workshops shaping beads. Women may have ground grain in courtyards, baked bread, and cared for children. Men carried goods to markets or along trade routes. Children played with clay animals and carts, chasing each other through narrow alleys. At night, families gathered in courtyards, lamps flickering against brick walls, listening to stories or songs. Archaeology does not record these moments, but they were the fabric of the city's existence. And yet, the question lingers: how could a civilization so advanced in organization, trade, and urban planning disappear so thoroughly from memory? Was its silence a result of its decline, or of our inability to read its script? If tomorrow the script were deciphered, would Mohenjo-Daro suddenly step into history's spotlight as brightly as Egypt or Mesopotamia? Or would it remain, even with words unlocked, a civilization defined by the quiet routines of daily life? The silence of Mohenjo-Daro is striking. You can walk today through its excavated streets' brick walls, rising just high enough to outline houses, straight avenues stretching in grids, and stairways that once led to second floors now open to the sky. Yet no names echo here, no kings proclaim victories, no inscriptions tell of battles, conquests, or divine commands. Instead, you stand in the midst of a city that once thrived with tens of thousands of people and now offers only the muted testimony of bricks. The decline of Mohenjo-Daro remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. By around 1900 BCE, the city was already fading. Houses were abandoned, drains clogged, and public buildings fell into disuse. Archaeologists see signs of disorder in the layers, debris left uncleared, makeshift repairs to walls, and haphazard construction replacing the earlier precision. Something had changed. One theory points to climate. The Indus River, which gave life to the city, shifted its course. Floods that once nourished fields may have become irregular, to strong some years, and absent in others. Crops failed, water supplies dwindled, and people were forced to move. Another theory speaks of declining trade. Connections with Mesopotamia weakened as the region faced its own upheavals, cutting Mohenjo-Daro off from networks that sustained it. Still others suggest disease, natural disaster, or gradual social decline. Whatever the cause, the end was not sudden. There was no firestorm like Pompeii, no invasion carving destruction into walls. Instead, Mohenjo-Daro declined quietly, family by family leaving, workshops closing, and markets emptying. Slowly, the city that had been carefully planned and maintained unraveled. By 1700 BCE, the Indus civilization itself had largely disappeared, replaced by smaller settlements and shifting cultures. Imagine what it meant for the last families. You wake one morning to find your well dry or your fields barren. You walk through streets once full of neighbors, now half empty. Children no longer laugh in the courtyards as they once did. Merchants no longer call out prices in the market. Priests no longer fill the great bath with water. Bit by bit, life contracts. The city becomes less a place of thriving and more a place of endurance, until finally, even endurance becomes impossible. And then the silence deepened, sand and silk-covered walls. The Indus shifted again, leaving ruins buried beneath earth for centuries. No one remembered the name, not even in legend. Unlike Atlantis or Ubar, Mohenjo-Daro left no myths of divine punishment. It disappeared not into a story, but into absence. When British archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1920s, they were stunned to realize that one of the world's great civilizations had been completely forgotten. The rediscovery revealed not kings or battles, but the ordinariness of life. Rows of houses with courtyards, drains with brick covers, pottery, beads, toys, and tools. Each fragment speaks less of glory than of routine. Mohenjo-Daro is remembered today not for its monuments, but for its systems, its quiet ingenuity. In this way, it differs from Egypt and Mesopotamia, whose monuments and texts proclaim greatness. The Indus speaks for people who valued order, cleanliness, and community, and yet questions remain unanswered. Who ruled the city? How were decisions made? What gods were worshipped? What stories were told in courtyards at night? The script may hold these answers, but until it is deciphered, we can only guess. The people of Mohenjo-Daro remain anonymous, their voices sealed in symbols, carved thousands of years ago. This anonymity is perhaps the city's most profound feature. It forces us to reflect on how civilizations are remembered. We celebrate names Ramses, Hammurabi, Alexander. We remember monuments that defy time. But what of the civilizations that valued systems over spectacle and routine over grandeur? Mohenjo-Daro challenges us to see greatness not in kings or battles, but in drains, wells, and orderly streets. Standing at the site today, you hear the wind blowing across brick mounds. The Indus River flows in the distance as it has for millennia. Farmers plow nearby fields, unaware that beneath their soil lie the remnants of one of humanity's first great cities. The silence of Mohenjo-Daro is not tragic, it is peaceful. It reminds us that even when names fade, the traces of human effort remain, waiting to be uncovered. And so, we end this story with a thought. Perhaps Mohenjo-Daro's greatest legacy is not what it tells us, but what it withholds. Its silence forces us to imagine, to reflect on the fragility of memory. It asks us, will our own cities, with their monuments and names, one day be remembered, or will they fade into silence, leaving only bricks, drains, and unanswered questions beneath the sands? When you picture the Roman Empire, your mind likely drifts to Rome itself, the Colosseum, the Forum, the aqueducts arching across hillsides, or perhaps to Pompeii, frozen in volcanic ash, or to Hadrian's Wall at the misty edge of Britain. Yet the Roman world stretched far beyond Italy and Europe. It extended deep into North Africa, across deserts and coastlines, where cities rose that rivaled Rome itself in beauty and scale. One of the grandest of these was Leptis Magna, a city in present-day Libya, once called the jewel of the desert. Leptis Magna sits near the Mediterranean coast, about 80 miles east of modern Tripoli. Its origins predate Rome by centuries. It began as a Phoenician settlement around the 7th century BCE, one of many outposts established by seafaring traders from Tyre and Sidon. These traders sought harbors along the African coast to support their voyages and commerce. Leptis Magna grew as a port, connecting North Africa's hinterlands rich in grain, olive oil, and wild animals with Mediterranean markets. When Carthage rose to power, Leptis fell under its sway. And when Carthage was destroyed in 146 BCE, Rome inherited its network of cities. Under Rome, Leptis Magna expanded dramatically. By the 1st and 2nd century CE, it had become one of the most important cities in Africa, rivaling Carthage itself. Its prosperity came from trade grains shipped to feed Rome's swelling population, olive oil carried in amphorae across the sea, and exotic animals captured for gladiatorial games. Walking through Leptis Magna in its prime, you would have seen a city designed with Roman precision, but infused with local wealth. Wide colonnaded streets stretched across neighborhoods. Markets bustled with merchants selling bread, oil, pottery, and textiles. Temples rose in honor of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Theaters echoed with the voices of actors and the cheers of audiences. Public baths steamed with hot water as citizens relaxed, gossiped, and conducted business. Every aspect of Roman urban life, from entertainment to hygiene, unfolded here against the backdrop of the North African sun. What gave Leptis Magna its unique grandeur was its native son, Septimius Severus. Born in Leptis in 145 CE, Severus rose through the Roman military and political ranks to become emperor in 193 CE. As emperor, he lavished attention on his hometown, transforming it into a showcase of Roman power and African wealth. He commissioned massive building projects, a new forum, a grand basilica, expanded harbor facilities, and an arch in his honor that still stands today. The Severan Basilica, in particular, testified to ambition. Its vast hall, flanked by towering columns of imported marble, dwarfed many other civic buildings in the empire. The Arch of Septimius Severus, decorated with carvings of victories and ceremonies, greeted travelers entering the city. For visitors arriving by sea, the harbor expanded and fortified under Severus presented a spectacle of Roman engineering and a place that once had been only a Phoenician trading post. But beyond grandeur, daily life in Leptis Magna unfolded in quieter routines. Citizens walked shaded colonnades to buy food in markets. Bakers prepared loaves in clay ovens, while millers ground grain imported from inland farms. Olive presses churned slowly, their wooden beams creaking as stone weights pressed fruit into oil. Traders filled amphorae with oil, sealed them with clay stoppers, and loaded them onto ships bound for Rome. Children played in courtyards, chasing one another with carved wooden toys, while their parents negotiated prices for cloth or spices. The rhythm of the city was not only imperial display, but also ordinary repetition. The desert framed this life constantly. Just beyond the city's edge, the Mediterranean gave way to scrub and sand. Caravans brought goods from deep inland, ivory, gold, perhaps even slaves. Camels plodded into the city's gates, their bells jingling faintly. At night, winds carried fine grains of dust through colonnades, settling quietly onto polished stone floors. Citizens of Leptis Magna lived with both abundance and the awareness that beyond their walls stretched the vast emptiness of the Sahara. Religion blended here as well. While Roman gods dominated official temples, local traditions endured. Inscriptions and artifacts reveal worship of Punic deities alongside Roman ones, a reminder that empire never fully erased local identity. Families may have offered oil at Roman altars by day and whispered prayers to older gods at home by night. The city's culture was a mosaic Roman in architecture, African in origin, and Mediterranean in commerce. Archaeologists marvel at how much of Leptis Magna survives today. Buried under sand for centuries, its ruins are remarkably intact. Columns stand upright, mosaics remain in place, and arches frame the sky. This preservation comes from the very desert that once threatened it. Unlike Tanis, swallowed by marshes, Leptis was entombed by sand, which protected stone from erosion. What nature buried, it also preserved. But in its time, Leptis Magna's glory was not eternal. Though Septimius Severus expanded the city, its prosperity depended on imperial favor and stable trade. When Rome's strength faltered in the later centuries, Leptis Magna suffered. Grain shipments slowed, caravans dwindled, and maintenance of grand buildings lapsed. The desert pressed closer. For now, though, in this first part of its story, we see Leptis Magna at its height, a city of wide avenues, bustling markets, steaming baths, and glittering basilicas. It was Rome, in Africa, shaped by empire but rooted in local soil. A city that looked both to the Mediterranean and the Sahara, balancing between abundance and fragility. And so the question arises, how does a jewel of empire, celebrated by an emperor himself, fall into silence beneath sand? Is it the desert that claims it, or the empire that forgets it? At its height under the Severan dynasty, Leptis Magna embodied the wealth of Rome's African provinces. To understand its prosperity, you have to imagine the constant flow of goods that moved through its streets, harbors, and markets. Grain from inland farms, olive oil pressed in countryside estates, and exotic animals captured in deserts and savannas, all of it passed through Leptis before traveling onward to Rome and beyond. The city was not just a provincial port, it was a crucial artery feeding the empire. The Roman world depended on African grain. The population of Rome swelled to nearly 1 million people by the 2nd century CE, and they had to eat North Africa's fertile plains. Nurtured by seasonal rains and supported by irrigation, became the empire's breadbasket. Ships filled with wheat sailed northward across the Mediterranean, unloading in Italian harbors where officials distributed grain. Through the Annona system, Rome subsidized food supply. Every loaf baked in Rome owed something to farms beyond Leptis Magna, and Leptis itself. This agricultural wealth created a vibrant economy. Large estates, worked by peasants and slaves, produced surpluses of grain and oil. Merchants bought these surpluses, transported them to storage warehouses near the harbor, and prepared them for shipping, every filled with oil-lined courtyards. Their clay bodies sealed with pitch or wax, oxen carts rolled through city gates carrying grain, sacks, while millers ground some of it into flour for local markets. The harbor never slept, with sailors, stevedores, and traders working day and night. The city's olive oil was especially prized. North African oil was thick, fragrant, and abundant. Archaeologists have traced its amphory across the Mediterranean in shipwrecks and Italian towns, and even in far-off provinces. Each amphora bore simple markings indicating weight, origin, or merchant. Workers filled them in presses outside the city, where wooden beams, stones, and patient labor turned olives into liquid gold. The presses creaked, the oil flowed, and workers carefully funneled it into jars. This routine, repeated endlessly, sustained both the empire and the fortunes of Leptis Magna. But Leptis was more than an exporter. Its markets bustled with imported luxuries. Ships arriving from the east brought glassware, spices, and silk. From Europe came wine, fine pottery, and tools. Caravans from the Sahara brought ivory, gold, and exotic animals, lions, leopards, and ostriches destined for Rome's circuses and amphitheaters. Imagine the strange sight: camels plodding into Leptis, carrying cages, the growl of a restless lion echoing against marble arches, as handlers negotiated sales with Roman officials eager to supply the Colosseum. Within the city, daily life reflected both wealth and routine. The Severan Basilica served as a center for legal proceedings and civic administration. Citizens gathered there to resolve disputes, while scribes recorded decisions on wax tablets. In the markets, bread sellers shouted prices, butchers displayed cuts of meat, and women bargained for olive oil or cloth. Children darted between stalls, while musicians played flutes or drums in shaded courtyards. Public baths provided both relaxation and necessity. Hot rooms, cold pools, and exercise yards where gossip and business flowed as freely as water, religion, too, was woven into this daily rhythm. Temples to Roman gods stood alongside shrines to Punic and Berber deities. Priests carried out sacrifices, burning incense, pouring libations, and chanting hymns. But private homes also bore small altars where families offered oil or wine to household gods. Festivals filled streets with processions, music, and decorated garlands, blending Roman pomp with African roots. Yet behind the grandeur lay fragility. Leptis Magnus. Prosperity depended on empire-wide stability. As long as Rome's fleets controlled the seas and its armies secured frontiers, trade flowed. But when cracks appeared in the imperial system, the consequences rippled quickly to Leptis. After the reign of Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla, the empire entered a period of turbulence. Political instability weakened central authority. Tax burdens increased, pressing local elites to fund both civic projects and imperial demands. Grain shipments became harder to organize as corruption crept into administration. The once thriving economy of Leptis began to strain under these pressures. The geography of Leptis added further vulnerability. While the Mediterranean connected it to Rome, the desert pressed close behind. Maintaining caravan routes required constant negotiation with nomadic tribes. When Roman authority weakened, those tribes disrupted trade. Caravans became risky, and merchants faced losses. Without steady supplies of ivory, gold, and animals, one of the city's key advantages diminished. Even the very structures that testified to its grandeur required upkeep. Marble colonnades cracked in the heat, harbor walls eroded under waves, and basilicas needed repairs. When funds dwindled, maintenance slowed. Citizens walked past scaffolding left unfinished, through streets where weeds crept between stones. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but gradual neglect, the slow unraveling of systems once meticulously maintained. Ordinary people felt this decline in subtle ways. Bread grew more expensive as grain shipments faltered. Taxes consumed larger shares of household. Income festivals became less frequent, their processions smaller. Families that once bought imported luxuries settled for simpler goods. The buzz of markets dulled, the harbor grew quieter, and the baths were no longer filled to capacity. Life continued, but with less vigor, less promise. Archaeologists find traces of this decline in the layers of debris, broken amphorae discarded without replacement, buildings repurposed into workshops or homes, their grandeur lost, streets where drains clogged with dirt were no longer cleared. It is in these small signs, not dramatic destruction, but slow abandonment, that we read the city's fading pulse. Leptis Magnus still possessed beauty, but beauty alone could not sustain it. By the 3rd century CE, as Rome struggled with internal crises, North Africa bore the weight. Caravans thinned, harbors emptied, and the desert pressed closer. The city's grandeur, once bolstered by imperial favor and trade, began to stand on shaky ground. So we pause here, at this moment of tension. A city still magnificent, its basilicas and arches still gleaming, but with cracks beneath the surface. Leptis Magna was not yet ruined, but the forces that would undo it had already begun. And so the question lingers: when prosperity rests on empire, what happens when empire itself begins to falter? Leptis Magna's decline did not come in a single moment of catastrophe. There was no volcanic eruption, no sudden invasion that wiped the city from memory in a single stroke. Instead, its unraveling stretched across centuries, slow, uneven, and almost invisible to those who lived it. The city that had once dazzled visitors with marble, basilicas, and colonnaded streets faded step by step into silence. The first blows came not from the desert, but from the empire itself. After the death of Caracalla into 17 CE, the Severan dynasty lost its hold on Rome. Without an emperor born in Leptis to champion its interests, the city lost political favor. Funds for grand projects slowed. Imperial attention shifted elsewhere. Governors rotated quickly, and fewer resources flowed south to maintain the basilicas, harbors, and aqueducts. Leptis Magna still stood proudly, But its ties to Rome were no longer guaranteed. The 3rd century CE brought further strain. Rome plunged into what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a time of constant civil wars, short-lived emperors, and external invasions. The Mediterranean economy fractured. Trade routes that once carried olive oil, grain, and animals across seas and deserts grew uncertain. Pirates harassed shipping lanes. Nomadic tribes pressed against caravan routes. Grain from North Africa still fed Rome. But Leptis Magna no longer thrived as it once had. The desert, always present, began to encroach more boldly. Without constant upkeep, sand crept into streets, discoated markets, and dunes pressed against outer walls. Caravans grew fewer. Markets grew quieter. Families who had once flourished turned to subsistence. Grand courtyards fell silent, their colonnades casting shadows over empty floors. The great Severan Basilica, once filled with voices of lawyers and citizens, echoed now with pigeons and wind. By the 4th century, Christianity had spread across the empire, including North Africa. Temples that had honored Roman gods became obsolete. Some were converted into churches, others abandoned. The shift altered the rhythm of life. Festivals once filled streets with incense and garlands. Now processions of a different kind gathered in courtyards. For some, this offered continuity. For others, it underscored the city's transformation into something less Roman, less imperial. The decisive blow came with the Vandals in the 5th century. And for 39 CE, the Vandal kingdom seized Carthage, and with it, control of much of North Africa. Leptis Magna, already weakened, could not resist. The Vandals stripped it of resources, pulling down monuments, melting bronze, and neglecting maintenance of harbors and aqueducts. A century later, Byzantine forces under Justinian recaptured the region, briefly reviving the city. They built new fortifications, reusing stones from older buildings. But the revival was short-lived. Earthquakes in the 6th century damaged key structures, and the harbor, clogged with silt and neglected repairs, became unusable. The final decline was quiet. By the time Arab forces entered North Africa in the 7th century, Leptis Magna was already a ruin. Its people had drifted away to smaller settlements inland, where survival was easier. The great basilica lay in fragments. Markets stood empty. The desert reclaimed streets where once merchants shouted and children played. For more than 1,000 years, Leptis Magna slept under sand. The very force that had pressed upon it now became its protector. Unlike Tanis, whose ruins dissolved into delta mud, Leptis endured beneath dunes. The sand preserved columns, arches, and mosaics, shielding them from rain and erosion. When European explorers reached the site in the early modern period, they were astonished at how much survived. Today, archaeologists marvel at its preservation, a Roman city almost complete, standing in silence under the desert sun. To walk through Leptis Magna now is to step into a ghost city. The Arch of Septimius Severus still rises, its reliefs crisp in the light. Colonnaded streets stretch in straight lines, their shadows sharp on stone pavements. The Severan Basilica's towering columns stand like sentinels over emptiness. The theater overlooks the sea, where waves lap against quiet shores. You can wander for hours and feel as though the inhabitants have only just stepped away. And yet, no voices return, only the wind moves here, carrying sand across stones. Daily life is gone, but it lingers in traces. Inscriptions carved in Latin still cling to walls. Grinding stones hint at bread once baked. Mosaics show patterns that decorated homes. These fragments remind us that behind every arch and colonnade were ordinary people, bakers, sailors, priests, slaves, and children. Their laughter, arguments, and footsteps once filled these spaces. Now, only the structures remain, preserved by chance. Leptis Magna's story is one of contrasts. It rose from a Phoenician trading post to a Roman jewel. It flourished under the patronage of an emperor, then withered under the weight of neglect. It was swallowed by sand, only to be preserved by that same sand. Today, It stands as one of the best preserved Roman cities in the world, yet it remains largely unknown compared to Pompeii or Carthage. Its fate was shaped not only by empire and desert, but also by memory, what people chose to remember and what they forgot. And so we ask, what do we learn from Leptis Magna? That empire brings grandeur, but also fragility. That prosperity built on trade can vanish when roots shift. That sand, which threatens, can also preserve. And that even the most magnificent jewel of an empire can be buried until only silence remains. Perhaps the more unsettling question is this: if Leptis Magna, with all its marble and arches, could vanish beneath the sands, what of our own cities? What forces, slow and relentless, might one day erase our streets, our markets, and our basilicas of glass and steel? High on a windswept plateau, where the grasslands of Armenia roll toward the distant Caucasus Mountains, there lies a city that was once called the City of 1001 Churches. Today, Ani is silent, its ruins scattered along the banks of a deep gorge that marks the border between modern Turkey and Armenia. Cows graze among tumbled stones, wildflowers grow between broken walls, and the wind whistles through empty windows where once prayers and chants echoed. This is Ania City, that flourished as a medieval capital, then faded into silence, swallowed not by desert sands but by time, war, and neglect. Ani's story begins in the 5th century CE, when it was little more than a fortress. Its location was strategic, perched on a high plateau near the Acroion River. It commanded trade routes linking Byzantium, Persia, and the Arab world. Over the centuries, Armenian princes fortified the site, building walls and towers to control the surrounding plains. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Ani had grown into a thriving capital under the Bagratid dynasty, the Armenian royal house that made it their seat of power. To enter Ani in its prime was to walk into a city of stone churches, markets, and palaces. The Bagratid kings invested heavily in construction, building cathedrals with soaring arches, intricate carvings, and domes that rose against the sky. The Cathedral of Ani, designed by the architect Tredat, was one of the largest churches of its age, its pointed arches anticipating Gothic forms centuries before they appeared in Europe. Around it clustered smaller churches, monasteries, and chapels, earning the city its poetic title. But Ani was not only a religious center. Its position alone. Trade routes made it a bustling hub of commerce. Merchants brought silk from the east, wine from the Caucasus, furs from the north, and spices from the south. Markets thrived with exchange, their courtyards filled with the calls of traders and the shuffle of goods. Craftsmen worked in stone, wood, and metal, producing tools, ornaments, and textiles. The hum of daily life echoed through narrow streets, bakers tending bread ovens, children carrying water, and priests preparing for liturgies. At its height in the 11th century, Ani may have held 100 people, a vast number for its time. The city was encircled by double walls, strengthened with towers and gates. These walls, built of volcanic tough stone, stretched across the plateau, visible for miles. Beyond the walls, farmland supported the city with grain, grapes, and livestock. Caravans entered through gates, their camels laden with goods, their bells clinking softly. Ani thrived not because of isolation, but because of connection to city. At the crossroads of empires, religion defined its skyline, but daily life defined its rhythm. Families gathered in courtyards to share meals of bread, cheese, and wine. Artisans carved crosses into stone lintels, decorating even modest houses with faith. Monasteries copied manuscripts, preserving scripture and learning. Farmers brought produce into the city, filling markets with vegetables, fruits, and dairy. Festivals filled streets with processions, candles, and song. To live in Ani was to live among faith and trade, in a city both sacred and practical. Yet Ani's greatness carried fragility. Its wealth made it a prize coveted by empires. Byzantines, Seljuks, Georgians, Persians, and Mongols all coveted its walls. Wars and invasions would scar the city repeatedly in centuries to come. But for now, in this first part of its story, Annie stands in its glorious city of stone churches gleaming under the sun, a city where trade and faith wove daily life together. Standing today among its ruins, you can still imagine the sound of bells ringing across the plateau, calling thousands to prayer. You can picture merchants entering through gates, their goods filling markets. You can feel the weight of its nickname, the City of 1001 Churches, as you count ruined domes. Scattered across the grass, Annie is silent now, but once it pulsed with life, faith, and commerce. And so we pause with the question, how does a city of such strength and devotion, fortified with walls and filled with churches, fade into quiet pastureland? What forces human and natural would reduce Annie to a place where only the wind remembers? Annie's grandeur made it vulnerable, the very qualities that allowed it to flourish. Wealth, strategic location, impressive walls also made it a target for empires circling the Caucasus. From the 11th century onward, the city's history became a series of sieges, occupations, and fleeting revivals. Each shift left its mark on the stones, its people, and its reputation. The first great blow came in 1045, when the Byzantine Empire absorbed Annie. At the time, the Byzantine emperors sought to expand their influence in Armenia, tightening their hold on the trade routes that passed through the region. When Annie was surrendered, its autonomy ended. Byzantine rule was brief but disruptive, introducing new administrators and shifting loyalties. For ordinary people, life continued, markets open, bread was baked, prayers rose in churches, but uncertainty grew. In 1064, Annie faced something far more devastating. The Seljuk Turks, expanding westward under Alp Arslan, besieged the city. Accounts describe the siege as brutal. The walls, long a source of pride, could not hold against persistent assault. When the Seljuks entered, destruction followed, churches looted, homes burned, and inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. Chroniclers painted the fall of Annie as a catastrophe, a day of mourning that echoed across Armenia. Yet even in ruin, Annie endured. Survivors rebuilt, traders returned, and the city limped forward. Under Seljuk rule, Annie became part of a different world. Mosques rose alongside churches, markets shifted under new administrators, and caravans carried goods under the banner of Islamic dynasties. The cultural mix deepened. Armenian stonework, Byzantine traditions, and Islamic architecture coexisted. The city became a mosaic, neither entirely Armenian nor entirely foreign. To live here was to adjust constantly, balancing old traditions with new rulers. The Georgians, too, left their mark. In the late 12th century, Queen Tamar's armies captured Annie, bringing it under Georgian control. For a time, this brought revival. Trade revived, walls were repaired, and churches were restored. The city's cosmopolitan air returned, with Georgian influence layered over Armenian roots. Pilgrims, traders, and artisans once again filled streets. The bells of Annie rang, if not as powerfully as before, at least with renewed strength. But Annie's revival was short-lived. The Mongols, sweeping across Asia in the 13th century, eventually reached the Caucasus. Annie, once again caught in the path of empire, suffered, while not annihilated in a single blow. The city paid heavy tribute, endured looting, and fell into decline. Repeated conquests stripped it of stability. The very trade routes that once sustained it shifted under Mongol influence, bypassing Annie for safer corridors. Through all of this, ordinary life persisted as long as it could. Farmers tilled soil outside the walls. Craftsmen carved crosses into stone, even as mosques rose nearby. Children played in courtyards shadowed by crumbling walls. Families lit candles in half-ruined churches, their prayers whispered amid broken arches. This persistence is what archaeology reveals most clearly: not only monumental structures, but also clay pots, tools, and small altars. Even in decline, Annie was inhabited by people trying to carry on. By the 14th century, however, Annie was a shadow of itself. Earthquakes shook its buildings, collapsing domes and splitting walls. Trade routes shifted further south, favoring other centers. Wars continued to destabilize the region. Gradually, people left. Merchants sought safer markets. Priests abandoned ruined churches. Farmers moved to villages less vulnerable to raids. The city of 1001 churches began to empty. Travelers who passed through Ani in later centuries described ruins already haunting. In the 17th century, European visitors noted churches standing roofless, walls split, and streets overgrown with grass. The city was no longer a capital, but a memory impressive, silent, melancholy. By the 18th century, Ani was abandoned completely, its walls guarding only wind and stone. What makes Ani's decline poignant is its gradualness. It was not wiped away in a single disaster. Instead, it died in fragments, a church roof collapsing here, a market fading there, a gate falling into disuse. Each generation saw a little less, until finally, there was nothing left to sustain the city. Standing among Ani's ruins today, you can see these layers of history in the stones. Churches still display Armenian carvings, delicate crosses, interlacing patterns, and inscriptions in old Armenian script. Nearby stand mosques built under Seljuk rule, with pointed arches and Kufic inscriptions. Georgian influences linger in decorative flourishes, while Mongol destruction is visible in collapsed walls. Each layer tells of conquest, adaptation, survival, and loss. Ani's story in this period is one of resilience against overwhelming odds. Even after devastation, people rebuilt, prayed, traded, and hoped. Yet resilience has limits. When invasions come again and again, when earthquakes split foundations, when trade shifts permanently, no city can endure forever. Ani's decline was not failure, it was exhaustion. And so the question lingers, if Ani, fortified by walls, blessed with churches, and cherished by dynasties, could not survive the weight of centuries, what does that say about the permanence of any city? Are even our strongest walls only temporary lines against time? By the late Middle Ages, Ani had become a ghost of itself. Its population had dwindled to a fraction of what it once was. Its churches stood roofless or cracked, and its markets were little more than courtyards visited by passing caravans. The double walls that once gave it strength no longer guarded bustling streets, but stood instead against silence. Gradually, even silence deepened as Ani was abandoned altogether. The city of 1001 churches slipped into ruin, its very name fading from memory. The final centuries of Ani as a living city were marked by neglect as much as by violence. Earthquakes in the 14th and 15th centuries tore open walls, bringing down domes and splitting foundations. The Akurian River, once a lifeline for trade and defense, cut deeper into its gorge, isolating the plateau further. The caravans that once threaded through Ani's gates found safer routes elsewhere. Bit by bit, the city emptied. Families who had lived in its stone houses for generations left for villages better protected from raids and famine. By the 18th century, Ani stood completely abandoned. What remained was ruin. But even ruins tell stories. Travelers who passed the site in later centuries described haunting scenes. Churches standing with gaping holes where domes had once risen. Inscriptions still legible on walls, though no one remained to read them, and grass sprouting where merchants once haggled. European explorers in the 19th century marveled at Ani's remnants, calling it an Armenian Pompeii. Though unlike Pompeii, Ani's decline was not sudden, but stretched across centuries. The ruins that survive today reveal the layering of Ani's history. The Cathedral of Ani still rises. Its pointed arches and fragments of domes are a reminder of Armenian architectural brilliance. The Church of St. Gregory stands partly intact. Its carved stone cross is still sharp despite centuries of weather. Nearby, the Mosque of Manukir, one of the earliest Islamic structures in the region, testifies to the city as Seljuk chapter. Georgian flourishes can be seen in decorative motifs, while the scars of Mongol raids and earthquakes mark other buildings. Ani is less a single city than a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten across centuries. Daily life, though long vanished, can still be imagined through the ruins. In courtyards where weeds now grow, families once shared bread and wine. In crumbling markets, merchants once called out prices, their scales weighing wool, silk, and spices. In chapels now open to the sky, monks once sang hymns by candlelight. Archaeologists uncover shards of pottery, metal tools, and fragments of manuscripts, the ordinary traces of lives that were as real as the stones that remain. These fragments remind us that Ani was not only a city of kings and priests, but also of bakers, farmers, and children. Ani's abandonment was complete, yet its memory endured in fragments of Armenian tradition. For Armenians, Ani became a symbol of past greatness, of loss, of endurance through ruin. Poems and songs remembered it as a city of faith, a jewel of the homeland lost to foreign conquest. In this way, Ani lived on, not as a city of stone, but as an idea, woven into identity and memory. Modern rediscovery has given Ani a different kind of life. Archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries documented its churches, cataloged its inscriptions, and studied its architecture. Today, Ani is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, yet its position on the border between Turkey and Armenia gives it a political silence. To celebrate it, but also isolate it, its ruins standing on contested ground. Visitors who walk among its churches today find themselves in a city that belongs as much to history as to any one nation. The preservation of Ani is both fragile and powerful. Its churches continue to crumble under the weight of time, yet their outlines remain. Stark against the plateau, wildflowers bloom among broken stones, bees hum through empty windows, and birds nest in towers where bells once rang. Nature reclaims Ani, but in reclaiming, it preserves. The plateau itself guards the city as though unwilling to let it vanish completely. And so Ani survives not as a bustling city, but as a memory carved into stone. Its churches, though ruined, still stand in enough number to justify its ancient nickname. Its walls, though broken, still stretch across the plateau. Its silence speaks louder than words, telling of the rise and fall of a city caught between empires, undone by centuries of struggle, and left to history. The lesson of Ani is not one of sudden tragedy, but of endurance and slow erosion. Greatness does not always end in catastrophe. Sometimes it ends in silence. A city once filled with the sound of prayers, markets, and bells is now filled with wind, grass, and birdsong. And yet, in its ruins, Ani speaks of resilience. For centuries, people rebuilt, adapted, and carried on. Even in decline, they prayed, traded, and lived, standing among its ruins today. You might ask, what does it mean that Ani, once home to 100,000 people and 1,001 churches, is now empty? Does it remind us that no city, however fortified, is immune to time, that faith and stone alike can falter? Or does it remind us instead that memory can outlast walls that even in silence? Ani continues to live as long as we remember its name. In the dry plains of southern Iran, where mountains rise like ancient guardians, and the air carries the faint scent of dust and stone, there lie the ruins of a city, once designed to embody the majesty of an empire. This city was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Its very name means city of the Persians. Today, its columns stand like broken teeth against the sky, its stairways carved with endless processions of tribute bearers. It is silent, visited by tourists and archaeologists. But long ago, it was the stage for kings whose empire stretched farther than any before it. Persepolis was founded by Darius I in the 6th century BCE, around 518 BCE, as a place not of daily government, but of ceremony. The Persians already had administrative capitals in Susa, Ecbatana, and Babylon, where scribes and officials managed the empire's vast bureaucracy. But Persepolis was different. Built at the foot of Mount Ramat, it was meant to awe. Its terraces, halls, and stairways were constructed not for ordinary citizens but for kings, nobles, and envoys who came to pay tribute. It was the empire's showpiece, a theater of power, ritual, and spectacle. Imagine approaching Persepolis in its prime. From the plain, you would see terraces rising from the earth, massive platforms carved into the hillside, stone staircases stretched upward, decorated with reliefs that told you what kind of place this was. Carved into the sides were rows upon rows of figures: Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, Indians, and Greeks, each carrying gifts, bowls, animals, cloth, vessels. The message was clear. The world had come to bow before the Persian king. At the top stood monumental gateways, guarded by colossal statues of bulls and winged creatures. These were not simply decorations. They were symbols of authority, myth, and divine protection. Passing through them, you entered halls so vast they seemed designed for gods. The Apadana, or audience hall, could hold thousands. 70 columns rose high, their capitals carved into the shapes of bulls, lions, and griffins. Light streamed in through open spaces, glinting on polished stone floors. Here, Darius and later Xerxes sat on thrones, receiving envoys from every corner of the empire. But what is striking about Persepolis is that it was not a city in the traditional sense. There were no crowded streets of common people, no bustling markets filled with bakers and cobblers. Instead, there were palaces, treasuries, and ceremonial halls. The laborers, artisans, and servants who built and maintained lived in surrounding settlements, not within the ceremonial heart itself. Daily life here was not about bread and trade, but about spectacle and ritual. Still, even ritual required routine. Artisans carved reliefs with slow patience, chiseling figures into stone. Builders hauled massive blocks, fitting them with remarkable precision. Gardeners tended royal parks, irrigating with channels that carried water from nearby rivers. Servants polished floors, arranged offerings, and prepared banquets for them. Persepolis was not only grandeur, but work, repetitive, demanding, endless. Their names rarely appear in inscriptions, yet their labor is preserved in every stone. The city's rhythm was tied to the Persian New Year festival, Nowruz, each spring. Delegations from across the empire traveled to Persepolis to present tribute. Imagine the slow procession. Camel caravans from Arabia carrying incense, Indian envoys leading elephants, Egyptians bringing linen and gold, Babylonians bearing vessels. They climbed the staircases, passed through gateways, and entered the halls. There, under the gaze of the king, they presented their gifts. It was a ritual of submission and loyalty, repeated year after year. For those who watched, it reinforced the idea that Persia ruled not only its own lands but the known world. What did ordinary life around Persepolis look like during these times? While the grand terraces belonged to kings, the surrounding region must have bustled. In camps housed travelers, artisans sold pottery and tools, farmers provided grain, dates, and meat for the influx of guests. Herds of animals were gathered for feasts. Bakers lit ovens, preparing flatbreads in bulk. Musicians played for banquets, their harps and flutes echoing in halls. Even in a city designed for ceremony, the ordinary patterns of survival and service persisted. Today, Persepolis is ruins, but the carvings still whisper of its purpose. Rows of tribute bearers, their faces calm, their garments distinct, remind us of the diversity of an empire that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. Each figure was carved not in haste but with deliberate care, a reminder that the empire valued order as much as power. To stand before them is to feel the weight of routine, the yearly processions, the repetition of ceremony, the endless reinforcement of loyalty. And yet, this city of ceremony raises a question. What happens when power is performed more than it is lived? Can a city survive if its purpose is only ritual? When we think of Persepolis, it is easy to imagine only the grandeur. Vast columns rising into blue skies, reliefs carved with meticulous detail, and kings seated on thrones receiving tribute from the far corners of the empire. But behind the spectacle lay a steady hum of labor and administration. Persepolis was a ceremonial city, yet it was also a working machine. sustained by thousands of hands whose names have mostly been lost. The Persepolis fortification tablets, discovered in the 20th century, give us a rare glimpse into this hidden world. Written in Elamite, they record rations distributed to workers, artisans, and travelers. We learn of women employed in workshops, of children receiving food allowances, and of laborers assigned to specific projects. These tablets do not tell of kings or victories. They tell of flour, dates, beer, and wages, the mundane details that kept Persepolis alive. A mason receives so many liters of grain. A weaver receives so many measures of beer. The empire's splendor was carved in stone, but its foundations were built on ledgers of bread and barley. Artisans working on reliefs must have repeated the same gestures endlessly, chiseling the curve of a robe, the shape of a beard, and the line of an arm bearing tribute. The uniformity of the carving suggests not individuality, but system. Each figure, Babylonian, Egyptian, Ionian, or Median, was carved to represent a type rather than a person. The work was repetitive, even monotonous, but the result was a visual encyclopedia of empire. For the artisans, it was labor. For the empire, it was ideology carved into stone. The treasury of Persepolis housed the wealth that poured in from across the empire. Gold and silver, precious vessels, textiles, and offerings were stored in massive halls. Tribute from conquered lands was carefully tallied and placed within guarded walls for envoys. To see such wealth gathered in one place must have been overwhelming, a silent reminder of Persia's reach. But for the officials who managed it, the task was bureaucratic counting, recording, and storing goods in an endless cycle of splendor. For those inside, meant paperwork and storage as much as glory. Daily life in Persepolis was defined by this tension between magnificence and routine. Servants swept the floors of the Apadana before ceremonies. Gardeners tended orchards and channels that irrigated royal parks. Herdsmen drove animals into holding pens to supply feasts. Bakers and cooks prepared meals for delegations. Musicians rehearsed the same melodies for festivals. The city was a stage, but every stage requires rehearsals, props, and workers who rarely take the spotlight. Yet for all its order, Persepolis carried within it the seeds of fragility. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia in the 330s BCE, Persepolis became a target. By then, it was less a living city than a ceremonial relic. The Persian Empire, weakened by years of internal struggles, could not stop Alexander's advance. When he entered Persepolis in 330 BCE, he saw not only a symbol of Persia's past glory, but also a treasury ripe for plunder. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some ancient writers claim Alexander deliberately set Persepolis ablaze as revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century earlier. Others suggest it was a drunken impulsive fire started during a banquet that raged out of control. Whatever the cause, flames swept through the wooden roofs of the palaces, consuming beams, collapsing halls, and blackening stone. Columns that had stood for centuries cracked in the heat. Reliefs of tribute bearers, carved with such care, were scorched. Gold and silver melted into molten lumps. The city, built to embody Persia's majesty, became ash under a Macedonian conqueror's torch. For those who witnessed it, the fire must have been both horrifying and mesmerizing. Imagine standing at the edge of the terrace, watching flames leap into the night sky, sparks scattering across the plain. Smoke choked the air. The crack of collapsing beams echoed. Like thunder, the glow lit up the mountains, visible for miles. For Persians, it was a wound. For Alexander, it was a statement, the symbolic destruction of a dynasty he had defeated. Yet even in destruction, daily tasks lingered. After the fire, workers picked through ruins, salvaging what they could. Officials attempted to record losses. Survivors returned to ordinary routines, though among blackened stones, even catastrophe, once past, settles into repetition, rebuilding, scavenging, adjusting. The ruins of Persepolis tell this story silently. Blackened stones still bear marks of fire. Carved reliefs remain, their edges softened by heat, Columns stand half-broken, their capitals cracked. The Apadana, once filled with tribute, is a forest of stumps where columns once soared. The fire did not erase Persepolis entirely, but it ended its life as a functioning city. For centuries afterward, Persepolis lay abandoned, sand and wind wore down stones. Locals called it Takhti Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, a mythical Persian king believing it was the seat of a hero from legend rather than the capital of Darius and Xerxes. Memory blurred, turning history into myth. Only in the modern age did archaeology uncover its true identity, piecing together tablets, inscriptions, and ruins to reconstruct its story. And so, Persepolis became a paradox. It was built to project permanence, to show the empire is eternal. Yet it lasted only to centuries before fire consumed it. Its reliefs speak of order, but its fate was chaos. Its wealth filled treasuries, but in the end, it melted into the ground. What remains today is not the living city, but the silence of ruins, columns against the horizon, staircases carved with endless processions, and fragments of halls open to the sky. Visitors walk among them, whispering, taking photographs, and trying to imagine what once was. The stones do not answer. They carry the scars of fire, but no voices. And so we pause with this thought. If a city built to symbolize eternity could burn in a single night, what does that say about the promises of power? Is grandeur any protection against the accidents of history? When the flames of Alexander's conquest faded, Persepolis was never rebuilt. Unlike other ancient cities that endured repeated destruction and reconstruction, Persepolis's life as a ceremonial capital ended in that single blaze. Its purpose to be the stage of Persian kingship was gone once the Achaemenid dynasty fell. Without kings to celebrate, without tribute to display, its terraces stood empty. The ruins remain, but the city itself had lost its reason to exist. For centuries, travelers passed by its stones without fully understanding what they were. Local people called it Takhti Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, a mythical king of Persia from ancient epic traditions. They believed the great columns and stairways belonged not to Darius or Xerxes but to a hero king who reigned in mythic time. This misunderstanding preserved the site in legend even as its true history slipped away. The ruins became part of folklore rather than history. A place admired but not inhabited, nature played its part in Persepolis' silence. The same dry climate that once nourished gardens and sustained irrigation also preserved stone. Rain was rare, the sun constant, sand and wind scoured surfaces. But slowly, reliefs carved with tribute bearers, animals, and kings remained clear even after 2 millennia. Columns, though toppled, lie where they fell. Staircases still rise in perfect order, their steps worn but intact. Unlike Tanis, swallowed by marsh, or Ani, cracked by earthquakes, Persepolis endured in fragments. A ruin, but not erased. Archaeology in the modern era restored Persepolis' place in history. Excavations in the 20th century uncovered the fortification tablets, which gave scholars insight into the everyday administration of the site. Inscriptions revealed the names of kings, dates, and events. Slowly, the city emerged from myth into history again, not just the throne of Jamshid, but the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. Yet even this rediscovery underscored its silence. The tablets told of rations and workers, not of triumphs or conquests. The ruins revealed columns and carvings, but not the voices of the people who lived around them. To walk through Persepolis today is to experience both grandeur and emptiness. The Apadana, once filled with thousands of envoys, now holds only tourists and the sound of footsteps on stone. The gate of all nations, where delegations once passed, frames only sky and horizon. The carvings of tribute bearers still line stairways, their robes detailed, their faces calm, their hands carrying gifts. They look as though they are still climbing, frozen mid-step for eternity, offering tribute to kings who are long gone. You might stand before these reliefs and wonder, who were these figures? Were they modeled on real envoys or on idealized types meant to symbolize entire peoples? Did the artisans who carved them ever imagine that thousands of years later, strangers would gaze upon their work in silence, trying to piece together a vanished world? These unanswered questions hover in the air, as steady as the hot wind that blows across the plain. The ruins also remind us that Persepolis was less about daily life and more about performance. It was not a city of markets, schools, or families in the way that Mohenjo-Daro or Ani once were. It was a stage where kings declared their supremacy through architecture. Once the actors were gone, the stage remained empty. In this sense, Persepolis teaches a different kind of lesson: grandeur. Without community fades quickly. The empire fell. The treasury was looted, and the fire destroyed roof sand without its central performance. Persepolis had no reason to endure as a living place, yet even in ruin, it continues to perform for modern visitors. Persepolis embodies the memory of Persia's greatness. It serves as a reminder of the vast empire that once stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. For Iranians, it is a symbol of cultural pride, a connection to ancestors who commanded the largest empire of their age. For scholars, it is a puzzle, a place where architecture, inscriptions, and tablets must be read carefully to reconstruct a vanished world. What Persepolis reveals most clearly is the tension between permanence and fragility. Its builders carved in stone, seeking to defy time, but time still wore it down. Its columns still rise, but only as fragments. Its reliefs still speak, but only in silence. The fire that Alexander set reduced its grandeur to ashes, yet the ruins remain, a compromise between destruction and endurance. As you leave the site in imagination, the sun lowering over the Zagros mountains, you glance back at the terraces. The columns are silhouetted against the fading light, stark and solemn. They look like guardians of memory, holding vigil over a city that is no longer a city, only a story in stone. The wind stirs, the plains stretch endlessly, and silence reigns. And so Persepolis asks us its final question: when power builds monuments to eternity, what happens when the empire that sustained them collapses? Does eternity lie in stone or in memory? And if memory fades, what remains, ashes or ruins? In the heart of the Syrian desert, where oases shimmer like mirages and caravan routes thread across barren plains, lies the ancient city of Palmyra. Its name, derived from the palms that grew around its springs, speaks of water in a dry land. For centuries, Palmyra thrived as a crossroads of trade, a place where east met west, where caravans laden with silks, spices, and precious stones passed on their way between Persia, Mesopotamia, and the Roman Mediterranean. Today, its colonnades stand broken, its temples scarred by war and neglect, but its memory lingers as one of the great desert cities. Palmyra's origins reach back thousands of years, though it flourished most during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. Situated between the Euphrates River and the Mediterranean coast, it controlled one of the few reliable oases along caravan routes. Traders from Arabia and Persia stopped here, watering their camels, resting under palms, and exchanging goods. From Palmyra, goods could be sent westward to ports on the Mediterranean or eastward toward Mesopotamia and beyond. Geography made the city valuable. Trade made it wealthy. At first glance, Palmyra might have seemed improbable. The desert stretched endlessly around it, and summer heat pressed down with unrelenting force. But its oasis changed everything. Springs bubbled up, irrigating fields where barley, wheat, and dates were grown. Palm groves provided shade, while gardens produced fruits and vegetables for the city's residents. Water turned the barren into the livable, and trade turned the livable into the prosperous. By the 1st century CE, Palmyra had become a Roman client state, benefiting from imperial protection while retaining a measure of independence. Roman roads connected it to Antioch and the Mediterranean, while local caravans carried goods across the desert. The city grew rich by acting as a middleman. Palmyrene merchants organized caravans that brought silk from China, spices from India, glass from Rome, and perfumes from Arabia. These goods passed through Palmyra's markets, taxed by officials, enriching the city's coffers. Walking through Palmyra in its prime, you would have seen wide colonnaded streets lined with shops and houses. Temples rose in the center, the most famous dedicated to Bel, a Mesopotamian god whose worship blended with Greco-Roman forms. Towers of stone dotted the necropolis outside the walls, where wealthy families built elaborate tombs decorated with portraits. Markets buzzed with activity. Camels groaned as loads were unloaded. Merchants haggled. Scribes recorded transactions on wax tablets, and children darted between stalls. The city was cosmopolitan in the truest sense. Inscriptions from Palmyra survive in multiple languages: Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. Gods from different traditions shared space. Roman soldiers mingled with Arab tribesmen, Persian envoys, and Jewish merchants. Palmyra was not only a trade hub, but also a cultural meeting point where styles of dress, speech, and belief overlapped. A visitor from Rome might have felt at home in its colonnades, while a trader from Mesopotamia would have recognized its temples. The city's wealth was visible in its architecture. Long colonnades stretched for more than a kilometer, lined with carved capitals and decorated arches. The monumental arch, the Temple of Bel, the theater, and the Agora all testified to prosperity. Yet this grandeur was also practical. The colonnades provided shade for traders, the Agora facilitated commerce, and temples anchored community life. What we see as ruins of beauty were once tools of daily survival and order. Life for ordinary Palmyrines revolved around routine. Farmers worked irrigated fields, harvesting grain and dates. Herdsmen tended camels, sheep, and goats, essential not only for food, but also for trade. Artisans carved stone, wove cloth, and prepared goods for caravans. Merchants organized journeys across the desert, hiring guards, guides, and drivers. Women managed households, ground grain, baked bread, and raised children. Priests performed sacrifices in temples, lighting incense and chanting prayers. Though Palmyra was wealthy, its wealth was built on ordinary labor repeated across generations. And yet, beneath this ordinary rhythm was a constant tension. Palmyra's prosperity depended on balance between great powers. Rome to the west and Persia to the east both coveted the trade routes that sustained the city. As long as Palmyra navigated this balance, it thrived. But as history would later show, when balance failed, the city paid the price. For now, in this first part of its story, we linger on Palmyra at its height, an oasis of stone and palm trees, where camels knelt in markets heavy with silk and incense, where temples rose against the desert sky, and where cultures mingled in shaded colonnades. It was not a city of empires, but a city between empires, and in that position lay both its strength and its fragility. And so the question arises, can a city that survives by balancing greater powers ever truly be secure? Or is its fate always to be decided by the empires it serves? Palmyra's golden age carried within it the seeds of its greatest gamble. Wealth made it strong, but strength invited ambition. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire itself was staggering under pressure invasions along its frontiers, civil wars between rival emperors, an economic strain that stretched its resources thin. In this environment of imperial weakness, Palmyra began to act not merely as a loyal client, but as a power in its own right. At the heart of this transformation stood a remarkable figure, Queen Zenobia. Zenobia's story has been told in many ways, some embellished with legend, others grounded in surviving records. She was the wife of Odenathus, a Palmyrene nobleman who had risen to prominence in the mid-3rd century. When Rome faced attacks from Persia, Odenathus defended the eastern provinces, earning Rome's gratitude. He bore the title Corrector of the East, ruling on Rome's behalf while building Palmyra's strength. But in 67 CE, Odenathus was assassinated, leaving Zenobia as regent for their young son. Vabalithus, Zenobia did not fade into the background. Instead, She stepped into power with extraordinary confidence, fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy, and skilled in politics. She commanded loyalty in Palmyra and respect beyond it. Under her leadership, Palmyra began to move beyond its role as Rome's eastern ally and toward independence. The empire's weakness gave her opportunity. Roman authority in the east was fragile. Emperors changed quickly, armies were stretched thin, and loyalty was uncertain. Zenobia seized this moment. Around the 70 CE, Palmyrene armies swept into Egypt, one of Rome's richest provinces, securing control of its grain supply. They pushed into Asia Minor, taking cities and establishing Palmyrene authority over much of the eastern Mediterranean. At its height, Zenobia's realm stretched from Egypt to Turkey, a mini-empire carved out of Rome's crisis. For the people of Palmyra, this expansion must have been exhilarating. Caravans no longer passed through their city under the shadow of Rome. Instead, Palmyra itself stood as a center of power. Soldiers marched beneath banners bearing local emblems. Taxes once paid to Rome now filled Palmyra's treasury. Temples and markets bustled with goods from newly conquered lands. For a brief moment, the desert city stood not between empires, but as an empire in its own right. But such independence was dangerous. Rome, though weakened, could not ignore a challenge to its authority. The Emperor Aurelian, a soldier emperor determined to restore order, turned his attention east. In the 70 CE, Roman armies marched against Palmyra. The conflict was not merely military, but symbolic. Could a desert city, however wealthy and ambitious, defy the empire that had once been its patron? The war unfolded quickly. At first, Palmyra resisted. Zenobia's armies fought bravely, defending key positions. Her leadership gave hope. Accounts describe her appearing among her troops, encouraging them, and presenting herself not only as regent, but also as sovereign. Yet Rome's legions were experienced, disciplined, and relentless. Aurelian defeated Palmyrene forces in a series of battles, advancing steadily toward the city itself. By late 272, Palmyra was besieged. Inside its walls, anxiety must have been palpable. Merchants, artisans, and families who had thrived in years of prosperity now faced the fear of starvation, fire, or slaughter. Zenobia, refusing to surrender, sought aid from Persia. But her attempt to escape eastward failed. Captured by Roman soldiers, she was brought before Aurelian. Without their queen, Palmyrenes lost their last hope. The city surrendered. Rome punished Palmyra harshly, though Aurelian spared much of the population. He executed leaders and stripped the city of wealth. In 273, when Palmyra rebelled again, Rome responded with destruction. Temples were desecrated, buildings burned, and survivors enslaved. The colonnades, bazaars, and temples that had once symbolized prosperity now stood scarred. Palmyra's brief empire was over. What makes this story striking is not only its drama, but also its ordinariness beneath the spectacle. For ordinary Palmyrenes, the shift from Roman ally to empire builder and back to ruin was lived in daily adjustments. One decade, taxes were paid to Rome. The next, to Palmyra's own rulers. 1 year, caravans brought prosperity. The next, soldiers marched through streets. Families who once welcomed merchants into shaded courtyards now huddled in fear during sieges. The rise and fall of kingdoms was experienced in bread prices, empty markets, and the silence of shuttered temples. Even in ruin, Palmyra did not vanish immediately. Rome rebuilt parts of it, and caravans still passed through for centuries. But its independence was gone. The city that had dared to challenge an empire returned to being a provincial town. Its colonnades still impressive, but its power muted. Zenobia herself became a legend remembered by some as a rebel and by others as a queen of brilliance and courage. Archaeology today preserves fragments of this story. Inscriptions record names of Palmyrene merchants and soldiers. Reliefs show caravans, camels, and gods. The monumental arch, though damaged, still frames the desert sky. The Temple of Bel, scarred by time, and recent conflict, stands as testimony to the city's faith and wealth. Each ruin carries both memory and absence, what once was and what can never return. And so, Palmyra's rise under Zenobia poses the question, was her ambition a moment of greatness or the beginning of inevitable ruin? Could Palmyra have remained safe had it stayed loyal to Rome? Or was independence always a dream destined to burn? After the defeat of Zenobia and the Roman retribution that followed, Palmyra never truly recovered its independence or its former splendor. The city that had once stood as a jewel of the desert, organizing caravans across continents and briefly ruling an empire of its own, slowly returned to being a provincial outpost. The colonnade still stretched across the oasis. The temple still rose above markets. But the heart of the city had been dimmed. For centuries after the rebellion, Palmyra lived on in diminished form under Roman administration. It remained a waypoint for caravans, its oasis still vital in the desert. Soldiers garrisoned its walls, and merchants continued to water their camels at its springs. But the grandeur of Zenobia's era was gone. Where once Palmyrene merchants had commanded routes from Egypt to Anatolia, now they were intermediaries again, subject to Rome's control. In the Byzantine period, Palmyra took on a different role. Christianity spread through the region, transforming temples into churches and altering rituals of daily life. The Temple of Bel, once dedicated to a Mesopotamian deity, was adapted for Christian use. Processions of incense and sacrifice gave way to hymns and prayer. The city remained important, but its identity shifted from caravan hub to frontier town of a Christian empire. Later, in the 7th century, the Islamic conquests reached Palmyra. Arab armies swept across the region, and Palmyra fell into their hands. Again, it adapted. Mosques rose near ancient temples, and Arabic joined Greek and Latin as a language of administration. Yet the city was already declining. Trade routes had shifted, favoring safer, shorter paths. Caravans no longer crowded its markets as they once had. Slowly, Palmyra shrank to a town, then to a cluster of villages scattered among ruins. By the Middle Ages, travelers described Palmyra less as a living city and more as a landscape of ruins. Arab geographers marveled at its colonnades, calling them the remnants of kings and giants. European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries carried back sketches of its arches and temples, astonished at their survival amid the desert. To them, Palmyra was a lost city rediscovered, a romantic ruin in the sands. Daily life, however, still lingered in small ways. Families lived in houses built within or beside the ruins. Farmers grew crops near the oasis, as their ancestors had done for millennia. Shepherds grazed animals among fallen stones. Children played in the shadow of half-broken temples. For them, Palmyra was not a lost city, but simply home, but one filled with reminders of a grand past. Modern archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed more of Palmyra's story. Excavations uncovered inscriptions in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin documenting the city's merchants, guilds, and gods. Reliefs showed caravans, camels, and scenes of trade. Temples and colonnades were studied, their architectural details showing the blend of Greco-Roman, Mesopotamian, and local traditions. Scholars pieced together Palmyra's role as a crossroads of empire, a city that thrived precisely because it lay between worlds. Yet Palmyra's fragility did not end with antiquity. In recent decades, war once again scarred its ruins. Conflict in Syria damaged temples and monuments that had survived nearly 2,000 years. The Arch of Triumph, the Temple of Bel, and other structures were destroyed or heavily damaged. For a moment, it seemed as though history itself was burning again in the desert. International efforts have sought to preserve and restore what remains, but the scars linger, reminding us that ruins are never entirely safe from the forces of human violence. To walk among Palmyra's ruins today is to experience layers of time. The colonnades still stretch into the horizon, though many columns lie broken. The theater still stands, its steps worn but intact. The Temple of Bel, though scarred, still reveals the grandeur of ancient stone. The necropolis towers remain, Some collapsed, others standing against the wind. And through it all, the desert presses close, its silence deep, its horizon endless. Palmyra teaches us that greatness can rise even in unlikely places, in an oasis in the desert, far from fertile valleys or imperial capitals. Its strength came from connection, from serving as the bridge between east and west. Yet this same position made it fragile, dependent on powers greater than itself. Its rise under Zenobia was bold, but its fall was swift, showing how dangerous it is for a city between empires to claim empire for itself. For the ordinary people who once lived there, Palmyra was not a stage for queens and emperors, but a place of work, worship, and survival. They fetched water from wells, baked bread in clay ovens, lit camels into markets, and lit candles in temples. Their lives were woven into the rhythms of trade and faith. Their traces remain not in monuments, but in pottery shards, inscriptions, and the faint wear of footsteps on stone. And so Palmyra stands today as both ruin and reminder. Its arches frame not only the desert sky, but the fragility of human achievement. Its silence speaks not of emptiness, but of endurance. The desert has claimed much, but it has also preserved enough for us to remember. Perhaps this is Palmyra's final lesson. That cities built on crossroads shine brightly, but briefly, they flourish on trade, connection, and balance. But when those currents shift, they fade. What remains is not only stone, but memory, and memory itself can be as fragile as desert winds. And so we ask, will Palmyra always be remembered as a crossroads of empires, or will it, like so many other lost cities, one day vanish even from memory, leaving only the desert to tell its story?